There is a photograph of John and Jackie Kennedy walking side by side across the south lawn of the White House. They are not touching, not even slightly. And yet the world looked at that image and saw the perfect American couple. The further back you pull from that picture, the stranger it becomes. Because long before Camelot, before the 1,000-day presidency the country spent decades mourning, there were other women, other arrangements, and secrets the Kennedy family worked very hard to keep buried. What you are about to hear is not the version taught in history class. The man before the myth. To understand how John Kennedy's marriages and relationships unfolded, you have to understand who he was before anyone put a title in front of his name. Jack Kennedy, that is what people close to him called him, grew up in a household shaped by ambition, Catholic tradition, and a father whose personal life was completely at odds with the image of family respectability the Kennedys projected to the world. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was a dominant force. He built a fortune, moved his family from Boston to New York and eventually to Hyannisport, and made it quietly but unmistakably clear that his sons were being groomed for greatness. The eldest, Joe Jr., was supposed to be the one who went into politics. Jack was the second son, the one who spent stretches of his childhood bedridden with one illness after another, reading voraciously, because there was not much else he could do. What Jack observed growing up was not a model of marital fidelity. Joseph Sr. made little effort to hide his long-standing relationship with Gloria Swanson, the Hollywood actress, while Rose Kennedy raised their 9 children and said nothing publicly, ever. What that atmosphere taught a young Jack about the nature of marriage, about what it was for and what it did not necessarily require, is something he would carry for the rest of his life. He was charming from a very young age. Friends from his prep school days at Choate described him as the kind of person who made you feel, when he was talking to you, as if you were the only person in the room. That quality followed him to Harvard, into the Navy, and into every room he ever walked into afterward. Behind that charm was a physical reality most people outside his inner circle did not know about. Jack Kennedy was genuinely ill for much of his adult life. He had Addison's disease, a condition affecting the adrenal glands, which went undiagnosed for years. His back, injured during his Navy service when his PT boat was rammed by a Japanese destroyer in August of 1943, caused him chronic pain that was at times debilitating. He took medications, steroids, painkillers, various injections administered by a physician named Max Jacobson, whom the press eventually nicknamed Dr. Feelgood. And the combination affected his mood, his energy, and almost certainly his judgment in ways that are difficult to fully untangle. The man who would become president was managing an enormous amount of physical suffering while performing the role of vigorous, youthful American leader. The private life that existed behind that performance required considerable cover. Before any of that, though, before the Senate, before the presidency, before Jackie, there was a woman named Inga Arvad, and her story is where things start to get genuinely complicated. Inga Arvad, the first great love. In 1941, Jack Kennedy was a young ensign in naval intelligence stationed in Washington. He was 24 years old, recently out of Harvard, and through family connections had secured a position in the Office of Naval Intelligence. Not exactly a combat post, but it placed him in Washington at a moment when the whole city felt electric with the approaching war. It was through his sister Kathleen, Kick, as the family called her, that Jack met Inga Arvad. Kathleen had become friendly with Inga through their work at the Washington Times-Herald, where both women wrote columns. She was Danish, 28 years old, and by every account of people who knew her, extraordinarily beautiful and even more extraordinarily intelligent. She had already lived a remarkable life. She had been Miss Denmark in 1931, worked as a journalist across Europe through the 1930s, and those travels brought her into contact with figures across the political spectrum, including, on more than one occasion, Adolf Hitler himself, who reportedly described her as the perfect Nordic beauty. Those meetings would come back to haunt her. When Jack Kennedy met Inga Arvad in late 1941, he fell for her completely. Those who knew him well said she was one of the very few women he ever genuinely loved, not merely pursued. They began seeing each other, and the relationship deepened quickly. The problem was that those past encounters with Hitler had attracted the attention of the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover's bureau had opened a file on Inga, suspecting she might be a German spy. Whether that suspicion ever had any real substance behind it, the surveillance was real. And because Jack was in naval intelligence, a position with access to sensitive information, the FBI began monitoring him as well. Agents recorded their conversations. They documented their meetings. Joseph Kennedy Sr. found out. He made clear, through the kind of forceful private communication the Kennedy patriarch was known for, that the relationship needed to end. Shortly afterward, Jack was transferred out of Washington to a post in Charleston, South Carolina, a move that many people in his inner circle believed was engineered specifically to put distance between him and Inga. Inga followed him to Charleston at least once. The relationship continued for a time after that, through letters and occasional visits. She later told people that she had offered to divorce her husband. She was married to a Hungarian film director at the time, and that she would have married Jack if he had asked. He did not ask. By 1942, the relationship had wound down. Jack shipped out to the Pacific. Inga eventually married someone else and had a successful life. But people who interviewed her decades later noted that she spoke about Jack with a tenderness that had not faded. There is an argument to be made that what Jack had with Inga Arvad was the most emotionally honest relationship of his life. What came after? The deliberate pursuit of the right kind of wife, the carefully managed image, the increasingly compartmentalized existence, was in many ways a departure from whatever authenticity he had shown with her. But by the late 1940s, Jack Kennedy was a congressman with Senate ambitions and a father who had mapped out a very specific future for him. And that future required a very specific kind of wife. The calculated courtship of Jacqueline Bouvier. Washington in the early 1950s was a city of parties, dinners, and carefully curated introductions. The social circuit was small enough that the right people kept encountering each other in the right rooms, and it was at one of those dinners, a gathering hosted by journalist Charles Bartlett and his wife Martha in 1951, that Jack Kennedy first met Jacqueline Bouvier. She was 21. He was 33. She had just returned from a year studying in Paris, spoke French fluently, had a degree from George Washington University, and was working as a photographer and columnist for the Washington Times-Herald, the same paper, incidentally, where his sister Kathleen had once worked. She was not the kind of person who was easily impressed. That, apparently, was part of what caught his attention. Their courtship was not a whirlwind. It was slow and, on Jack's side, somewhat reluctant. He liked her. He was attracted to her. But he was also deeply absorbed in his political career and still operating by the habits of a bachelor who had never felt compelled to change them. Jackie, meanwhile, was perceptive enough to understand exactly what she was dealing with. Friends from that period described her as someone who entered the relationship with her eyes open, aware of his reputation, aware of the Kennedy family's expectations, and aware that what she was being offered was not a conventional romance. Jack proposed in 1953. Between the initial meeting and that proposal, there had been a gap. Jackie had left for London to cover the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, and Jack had briefly considered proposing to someone else entirely, a Swedish socialite named Gunilla von Post, whom he had met in the south of France. He wrote her letters suggesting that if they had met a year earlier, things might have gone differently. He eventually did not pursue that alternative, whether from sentiment, practicality, or his father's influence is difficult to say. The wedding took place on September 12, 1953, in Newport, Rhode Island. It was enormous. 800 guests at the ceremony, 1,200 at the reception. Archbishop Richard Cushing of Boston officiated. The guest list was a cross-section of American power and social prominence. The press coverage was breathless. What the press coverage did not touch was the fact that by the time of the wedding, Jackie had already developed a fairly clear picture of what her life inside the Kennedy orbit would look like. She had heard the stories. She had watched the Kennedy men. She had, by some accounts from people close to her, gone into the marriage with a kind of steely pragmatism that she kept very carefully hidden beneath the composure and the elegance and the smile. She needed to be composure and elegance and smile, because the man she married was about to become one of the most relentlessly pursued figures in American public life. And the pursuit was not only political. Senator Kennedy and the habits that would not change. Jack Kennedy was elected to the United States Senate in 1952, defeating the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. in a race that surprised many who had underestimated him. He was good-looking, well-funded, and ran a campaign his mother Rose later described as the first truly modern Kennedy family operation. Sisters and mother hosting tea parties across Massachusetts, the whole extended family deployed as political assets. By the time he married Jackie in 1953, he was already one of the more prominent young members of the Senate. His health remained a serious problem. In 1954 and 1955, he underwent 2 spinal surgeries that left him bedridden for months and, at one point, near death. While recovering, he wrote or heavily co-wrote a book called Profiles in Courage, published in 1957, which won a Pulitzer Prize the following year. It was during those long convalescent stretches that Jackie sat with him, read to him, and helped him pass the hours. Those who knew the marriage from the inside described those early years as genuinely complicated. There were periods of warmth and something approaching closeness, particularly when Jack was ill and the performance of public life was briefly suspended. And there were long stretches, especially when the Senate was in session, during which Jackie was essentially alone in ways that went beyond mere physical absence. The affairs were not a secret within the tight circle of people around Kennedy. His staff knew. His friends knew. The Washington press corps, operating under a set of unspoken rules about the private lives of public figures that would seem almost incomprehensible by later standards, knew and said nothing. Jack moved through the social world with a kind of comfortable entitlement about his personal life that reflected both his upbringing and his complete confidence that the lid would stay on. Some of the names from this period are well documented. Pamela Turner worked in his Senate office, and Jackie once confronted the situation directly, showing up at Turner's apartment and making her presence known to the landlady in a way that left little ambiguity. The landlady sent letters to the Kennedy family and to religious organizations. Nothing came of it publicly. What is striking about this period is not the affairs themselves, but the almost industrious compartmentalization required to sustain them. Jack Kennedy ran one of the most carefully image-managed political operations of his era, and at the center of that image was a marriage. Jackie was essential to it, cultured, multilingual, impeccably dressed. bringing an aristocratic elegance to the Kennedy brand that no political consultant could have invented. She was also privately struggling. She had a miscarriage in 1955. She delivered a stillborn daughter, whom the family named Arabella, in August of 1956, while Jack was on a sailing trip in the Mediterranean with friends. He did not immediately return when told. That detail, more than perhaps any other from this period, gives some measure of how wide the gap was between the public partnership and the private reality. She came very close to ending the marriage after that. People close to her have said she seriously considered leaving him. What kept her, by most accounts, was a combination of Catholic faith, Kennedy family pressure. Joseph Sr. is said to have had a direct and frank conversation with her about the political consequences of a divorce, and the fact that she had nowhere obvious to go. She had given up her career. She had built her identity around being Mrs. Kennedy. Walking away from that, in 1956, in the world as it existed then, was not the straightforward act it might seem in retrospect. So she stayed. And in 1957, their daughter Caroline was born. And in 1960, Jack Kennedy announced that he was running for President of the United States. The 1960 campaign and the secrets kept at scale. Running for president in 1960 meant that the image management had to scale up dramatically. Everything that had been contained within Washington's social world now had to be contained in the full glare of a national campaign. Jackie was pregnant with their son John Jr. during a significant portion of the 1960 campaign, which meant she was not always on the trail. When she was present, she was extraordinarily effective. Newsreel footage shows her drawing crowds as large as Jack did, sometimes larger. She spoke in French to French-Canadian crowds in New England and in Spanish to Spanish-speaking audiences. She was, in political terms, an asset of the First Order. Behind the campaign, the Kennedy operation was also managing things that were not publicly visible. One of the more significant involved a woman named Judith Campbell, later Judith Campbell Exner, who spoke and wrote about her relationship with Kennedy at length in the years since. She met him in February of 1960 at a party in Las Vegas, introduced by the entertainer Frank Sinatra. What Campbell Exner later described was a relationship that began during the campaign and continued after Kennedy took office, and that existed simultaneously with her connections to figures in organized crime. Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss, was among them. The FBI was watching Giancana, which meant the FBI was also watching the woman who was simultaneously seeing Giancana and the candidate for president. The full implications of that situation would continue unfolding long after November of 1960. Kennedy won the election by one of the narrowest popular vote margins in American history, 49.7% to Richard Nixon's 49.5%. On January 20th, 1961, he was inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. He was 43 years old, the youngest man elected to the office, and he delivered an inaugural address that people memorized and quoted for generations afterward. Jackie stood beside him in a pillbox hat and an off-white coat and looked, by every account of everyone who was there, absolutely extraordinary. The image of Camelot, the word would come later from Jackie herself in an interview she gave shortly after the assassination, was born that day. What it covered over was already complicated enough. What it was about to cover over was considerably more so. Inside the White House, the architecture of a double life. The Kennedy White House ran on two tracks simultaneously, and the people who worked there were generally aware of both, even if they never spoke about them directly. On the public track, the restoration of the White House was Jackie's project. She raised private funds, brought in historians and curators, and oversaw a transformation of the building that genuinely changed how Americans thought about it. She gave a televised tour in February of 1962 that drew roughly 56 million viewers. She hosted Pablo Casals, André Malraux, Igor Stravinsky. She made the White House a place where art and culture were treated as things that mattered. On the other track, the administration had established informal protocols the Secret Service and household staff understood. When certain visitors arrived through particular entrances at particular times, the standard procedures were adjusted. Dave Powers, one of Kennedy's closest aides, was often present at the pool, the White House indoor pool where Kennedy swam to ease his back pain, where gatherings that appeared on no official schedule took place. The names attached to this period include Mary Pinchot Meyer, a painter who had known Kennedy since their school days and who moved in Washington's most elite social circles. She was the ex-wife of a CIA official named Cord Meyer, and her own story would end in tragedy in 1964 when she was shot and killed while walking along the C&O Canal, a crime never definitively solved. She kept a diary. The CIA's James Angleton reportedly broke into her studio after her death looking for it. There was also the actress Marilyn Monroe, whose relationship with Kennedy became one of the most debated elements of Kennedy-era mythology. What is documented is that Monroe and Jack Kennedy had known each other socially since the late 1950s, and that she sang "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" at his May 1962 birthday fundraiser at Madison Square Garden in a performance so charged that the moment has been replayed and analyzed thousands of times since. Kennedy joked afterward that he could now retire from politics, having received such a thorough serenade. The audience laughed. Jackie was not at the event. She was at a horse show in Virginia that weekend. Monroe died on August 4, 1962, at her home in Los Angeles. She was 36. The official finding was a probable overdose. In the years since, the circumstances have been the subject of enormous speculation, centered largely on her relationships with both Kennedy brothers. What can be said with certainty is that her connections to the White House had already been, in the view of people close to the president, a source of considerable anxiety. Jackie, through all of this, maintained the performance. She was privately dealing with a marriage that operated on terms that most people would find unrecognizable, and she was also preparing for something that the whole country was about to discover she was far better equipped for than anyone had anticipated. She had another pregnancy. In August of 1963, she gave birth 5 weeks early to a boy named Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. The baby had a lung condition and lived for only 39 hours. Jack Kennedy, who by several accounts of people who were present was genuinely devastated by the loss, held the baby's hand in the hospital. He wept. Those who were there said they had never seen him cry before. Something shifted between Jack and Jackie after Patrick died. People who saw them together in the weeks and months that followed described a tenderness between them that had not been visible before, or had not been visible in years. She agreed to join him on a political trip to Texas in November of 1963, a trip she had initially been reluctant to make, given the exhausting pace of political travel and her recent loss. She went anyway. The women Washington whispered about. There is a category of Kennedy relationships that falls somewhere between the confirmed and the heavily circumstantial. Women whose names appear in enough accounts, memoirs, and FBI files that dismissing them is not really possible, but whose stories resist the kind of definitive telling that better documented cases allow. Ellen Romich was one of them. She was a young German woman who worked at a private club in Washington called the Quorum Club, essentially a gathering place for politicians and lobbyists that operated on an informal and not entirely transparent basis. She was beautiful. socially skilled, and, according to Hoover's files, possibly connected to East German intelligence. Those same files indicated she had also had a relationship with President Kennedy. When the FBI began moving toward a congressional investigation in 1963 that might have exposed her name and the names of other officials she had known at the club, the Kennedy Justice Department moved to have her quietly deported to West Germany. She left in August of 1963. The investigation did not produce the exposure that had seemed imminent. Whether the deportation was about national security, political protection, or both is a question the available documents do not entirely resolve. Hoover knew about all of it. J. Edgar Hoover had been collecting information about the Kennedys for years before the presidency. He had files on Inga Arvad going back to 1941. He had the surveillance records from that period. He knew about Judith Campbell Exner. He knew about the White House arrangements. And he used that knowledge, not necessarily by making direct threats, but by making sure the Kennedys understood, through periodic meetings between Hoover and Robert Kennedy, that he knew. It is one of the reasons why Robert Kennedy, despite his personal contempt for Hoover, and by most accounts he genuinely despised the man, could not simply remove him. Hoover had been director since 1924 and had survived every administration since. He had files on everyone. With the Kennedys, those files were leverage in the most direct and practical sense. Jackie Kennedy understood the landscape she was operating in. She was not politically naive. She had grown up watching her own father, a man named John Vernou Bouvier III, known as Black Jack, a hard-drinking socialite and serial womanizer, conduct his life in ways that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the one she ended up inside. She had her own ways of coping. She spent money, which sometimes caused friction because the amounts were significant. She traveled. She found in the White House restoration and in her children a genuine sense of purpose that coexisted with everything else. What she said privately, to the small circle of people she actually trusted, was considerably more candid than the image she presented to the world. Gore Vidal, the writer, who knew her from before the Kennedy years, recalled conversations in which she was remarkably direct about her assessments of people and situations. She was, beneath the composure, someone who saw things very clearly and had simply made a calculation about how much of what she saw she was willing to show. Camelot's mythology and who built it. The word Camelot, as a description of the Kennedy White House, did not come from journalists or historians. It came from Jackie herself, in a conversation she had with the journalist Theodore H. White just 1 week after the assassination. She had requested the interview specifically. She had things she wanted said, and she wanted to be the one to say them. She told White that Jack had loved the musical Camelot, that they would listen to the cast recording at night before going to sleep, and that his favorite line was from the last song in the show about how a brief, shining moment had once been known as Camelot. She asked White to make sure that made it into print. White did as she asked. The Life magazine piece that resulted was the origin point of the entire Camelot mythology. The idea of the Kennedy presidency as a golden age, brief and brilliant, and tragically cut short. Jackie built that myth deliberately and with full awareness of what she was doing. She understood that memory is something that can be shaped, and she set about shaping it immediately, while the country was still in shock. It was, in its way, a masterpiece of narrative management, and it was built, at least in part, to cover over everything that the 1,000-day presidency had actually contained. What is notable is not that she did it. The impulse to protect the dead from full exposure is entirely human, but the scale at which it succeeded. For decades afterward, The Camelot framing dominated how the Kennedy presidency was understood. The critical histories came later, slowly, as documents were declassified and participants grew old enough to speak. By the time a fuller picture was available, the myth had already done its work, taught in schools, repeated in documentaries, woven into how America remembered the early 1960s. Jackie herself lived 30 years after Dallas. She remarried Aristotle Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate, in 1968, in a union that shocked the country and permanently complicated the image she had built. And she later had a serious career as a book editor in New York. She died in May of 1994 from non-Hodgkin's lymphoma at 64. In the final years of her life, she gave very few interviews and said very little about Jack publicly. What she had said in that week, immediately after the assassination, remained the version she wanted on the record. Everything else she kept. The Onassis marriage, Jackie's own reinvention. To understand why Jackie married Aristotle Onassis in October of 1968, you have to understand what her life looked like in the years between Dallas and that wedding. After November 22nd, 1963, she left Washington almost immediately. The city held too much of the life she had lived there. She moved to New York, eventually settling into an apartment on Fifth Avenue. She was 34 years old, one of the most recognizable women on earth, and in many ways profoundly alone. She had 2 young children and the entire weight of a national mythology resting on her. Every public appearance was an event. She could not step outside without photographers and crowds demanding the performance that had defined her adult life. Robert Kennedy had become an anchor for her in those years, the family member closest to her, involved in her children's lives, sharing a grief that no one outside the family quite could. When Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles in June of 1968, shot at the Ambassador Hotel on the night of the California Democratic primary, Jackie reportedly told people close to her that she now understood the Kennedys were a target, that America was dangerous, and that she needed to get herself and her children somewhere safe. Aristotle Onassis offered that safety. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He had a private island, Skorpios, off the coast of Greece, a yacht, and the resources to build around Jackie and her children a layer of security and privacy that simply did not exist in New York. He was also 62 years old, shorter than her, twice divorced, and connected through his various business dealings to an assortment of arrangements that did not survive close scrutiny. He had carried on a years-long relationship with the opera singer Maria Callas, one that Callas believed was heading toward marriage. When Onassis chose Jackie instead, Callas was reportedly devastated. The marriage was not a love match in any conventional sense. It was an arrangement, mutually beneficial, entered into by 2 people who understood what each was providing. Jackie got security and financial independence on a scale nothing else could have offered. Onassis got the most famous woman in the world. He was also difficult to live with. He was controlling about money, and disputes about their prenuptial agreement became well known after his death. His son Alexander died following a plane crash in January of 1973, a loss that seemed to accelerate Onassis's own decline. He died in March of 1975. The legal settlement of his estate, complicated by his daughter Christina's intensely difficult relationship with Jackie, was prolonged and unpleasant. After his death, Jackie returned to New York, began her career in publishing, and entered the most genuinely content chapter of her life. She was with Maurice Templesman, a diamond merchant and longtime friend, from the early 1980s until her death. Their relationship was quiet, stable, and private in ways that nothing before it had quite been. What the records eventually revealed. The full paper trail of Jack Kennedy's personal life came out in pieces over decades, through declassified government documents, the deaths of participants who had stayed silent while alive, and the work of historians willing to sit with uncomfortable material. The Church Committee hearings in 1975, a Senate investigation into the intelligence community, produced revelations about the CIA and FBI that reframed much of what the Kennedy era had looked like from the outside. Among what came out was the full story of Judith Campbell Exner and her simultaneous relationships with Kennedy and Sam Giancana, and the question of what those overlapping connections meant for national security. The FBI files on Kennedy, portions released under Freedom of Information requests over the years, contain a picture of Hoover's operation that is both more systematic and more comprehensive than most people had assumed. Hoover was not merely aware of Kennedy's personal life. He was, in effect, its archivist. Campbell Exner gave her first full public account of the relationship in 1975, in a press conference prompted by the Church Committee disclosures, and went further in subsequent interviews and a memoir. Some of what she said has been corroborated by available documents. Some remains contested. What is not contested is that the phone records of calls between her and the White House are real, and that their timeline matches the period she described. Mary Pinchot Meyer's diary was eventually recovered. James Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief who admitted breaking into her studio after her death, later claimed he had found and destroyed it. Though some researchers have disputed that, her killing remains officially unsolved. The man charged with her murder, a laborer named Ray Crump, was acquitted by a jury in 1965. The marriage that history keeps rewriting. What do you do with a marriage like this one? Or more precisely, what does history do with it? For the first decade or two after Dallas, the answer was mostly protect it. The Camelot narrative was dominant, the participants were either dead or unwilling to speak, and the cultural investment in Jack and Jackie as the perfect presidential couple was enormous. People who had lived through those years, who remembered where they were when they heard the news from Dallas, who had watched Jackie walk behind the casket in her black dress and veil, did not want the picture complicated. Then slowly, the complications arrived. The Church Committee, the biographies digging into Kennedy's medical history, Seymour Hersh's 1997 book, which caused considerable controversy by being more direct about Kennedy's personal life than anything that had come before, the declassified documents, and the memoir by Mimi Alford, published in 2012, in which she described a relationship with Kennedy that began when she was a 19-year-old White House intern in the summer of 1962. She describes the experience with a candor that does not sensationalize, but does not flinch either. Alford's account matters not because it added to any count, but because of what it shows about the texture of power inside that White House. She was a teenager, new to Washington, completely dazzled by her surroundings. Kennedy's authority and charisma created a kind of gravity from which pulling away felt nearly impossible. The people around him facilitated rather than questioned. The presidency itself, as she experienced it, produced a state of almost total deference in the people within its orbit. Jackie Kennedy's awareness of all of this remains, even now, not fully mapped. There is a recorded conversation from 1964 conducted by the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. as part of an oral history project, in which Jackie is candid about her feelings on various subjects, but those recordings were sealed and not made public until 2011. Even in what was released, she was selective about what she chose to examine and what she left alone. What comes through the record, across all its contradictions and silences, is something more human than the myth allows for. Two people caught in an arrangement that served political purposes and came at considerable personal cost to both. A man genuinely capable of warmth, but shaped by his father, by his health, by the world he moved through, in ways that made sustained closeness very difficult. A woman more perceptive, more resilient, and more strategic than the image of fragile elegance ever suggested. A marriage built, sustained, and memorialized as something it never entirely was. The story does not end cleanly, because it was never a clean story. And the closer you get to the actual documents and the testimony of the people who were there, the more the clean lines dissolve, and something messier and more real takes their place. John Kennedy was in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, partly because Jackie had agreed to come. She was there because something between them had shifted after the loss of Patrick, because whatever the marriage was or was not, there was something in those final months that pulled them toward each other rather than away. The photographs from the Texas trip, in the hours before the motorcade, show them together in ways that look genuinely warm. She was beside him when the shots were fired. She held him. She was still wearing the dress, unwashed, when Lyndon Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One. She insisted on keeping it on. She wanted the world to see what had been done. And then, 1 week later, she sat down with Theodore White and told him about Camelot. The full truth of the Kennedy marriage, all its texture and contradiction and sadness and occasional tenderness, does not fit neatly into either the myth or the exposé. It sits somewhere in between, which is where most human truths actually live. It was a marriage shaped by immense ambition, genuine tragedy, and a profound imbalance of power. And somewhere underneath all of it, two people bound to each other in ways neither of them could entirely account for. The Camelot that Jackie built was not a lie, exactly. It was a frame. And like all frames, it showed you something real while leaving everything outside its edges in the dark. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.